Equity is like that gray area, a huge elephant in the room. And as of recent, you hear people talk about equity, equity, equity. Most people really aren't ready for equity, regardless of what nationality you say you are, regardless of who you say you are or who you're affiliated with. Most people way of thinking don't fit equity because most people are really not aligned with what they ought to be aligned with. And even worse, most people don't even deal with law. They run away from law. Most people these days try to use equity to run away from law. You have to understand law in order for you to be able to access equity. Law and equity go hand in hand. They're different jurisdictions of their own. But law and equity go hand in hand. They work with one another. In order for you to understand how equity works, you must understand how law works. Most people haven't even figured out half of it. Instead, are focused on other things that are completely unrelated. They're busy focusing on others' affairs, trying to do something on the other side somewhere, hoping that it's going to assist them, rather than actually enforcing law and the operation of law itself, which are often the public acts, the public law, etc. There's a maxim that goes, the law delights in equity. Meaning law works with equity. Two different jurisdictions. But in order for you to be able to access this, you must know this, because this delights in equity. It covets perfection. It is a rule of right. You can't just skip law and just try to jump into equity or chancery. Understand how law works, because that is your pathway to equity. And even at equity jurisdictions, there are still certain things that govern it. And some of the procedures in law are still adopted in equity. Some of the formalities are still there. The formalities is widely different, but in many ways, if you have to, it's like a degree, it's a step. You have to pass those degrees first before you go to the next one. You just don't skip the previous one and hope to survive in the other one. It doesn't work like that. Another maxim goes, law regards equity. Another one goes, in a fiction of law, equity always subsists. Equity always perpetuate. It would always continue. It would always be. So where law fails, or where there's no remedy at law, then you step into equity. Even when you start to look at stare decisis regarding equity, they will let you know for you to make equitable claims, you must first prove that you've exhausted all remedies available to you at law. How can you possibly exhaust your remedies at law if you don't know what they are, if they exist, and how to exhaust them? So don't run away from it. Learn how it works. Just don't jump at equity because it feels good to talk about it or you hear someone talking about it. Deal with the basic stuff first. Another maxim tells you equity follows the law. They're friends, they're buddies. They're never separate. It's like the two sides of your body. They're one and the same, yet different. Two sides of the same coins. One and the same, yet different. But they work hand in hand. Another maxim goes as far as to tell you where there's equal equity, the law must prevail. So in one circumstance, if law fails and you go into equity, equity is what upholds law. Equity is what keeps law upright. Equity is what balances what law lacks. Another maxim goes to tell you reason and law is perfect equity. And then law is always in harmony with equity. Yeah, they're different jurisdictions, but they still work together. Another one tells you law regards equity. Then they see one another eye to eye. They're not opposed to one another. Equity is just another step ahead. But you have to learn law and its operation. You have to understand it. You have to comprehend it. You have to learn the formalities behind law. And in some cases, you may not even want equity, because equity might not be where your solution is. Because once you really start to dig deep into equity, you realize equity is very raw. Equity can be harsh. Sometimes in equity, all that jury trial stuff, looking for somebody to be in your favor, going through voir dire and all these cross-examination stuff, you might not be able to do it in equity. It's very cutthroat, or at least equity can be way more cutthroat than at law. All that nature's law, nature's God stuff, that's equity. When you read Maxims that says nature is thrice great, all that, that's equity. Whatever intensity of what you're dealing with at law, equity has a higher fold of that. A lot of people these days always want to, attach monetary claims to things. Like, oh, I'm gonna sue them for money. They owe me this. The amount of if you detain me for this long, you owe me money. That's fine. That's cool. You can do that. Sometimes equity doesn't care about monetary damage. Equity cares about injunctive relief. But monetary damage, you're gonna have to do a good amount of work and put an amount of great effort to be granted monetary damage when it comes to equity. And you will often hear a lot of people kind of complain about law and equity being merged. When you read the Federal Rules of Civic Procedure, they tell you it's been merged. It's when you really think about it, when you really read the footnotes and the history behind why that is and how that is, you realize slowly that might actually be a good thing, because it allows you to seek remedy from both ends at the same time. Like, I don't get why people complain about that. Most people are not even ready for most people are not ready for equity. They're not living in a harmonious manner. All that stereotype about Muslims and so-called third world countries and how they have their laws being harsh and all that stuff, that's equity. In truth, most people actually don't want equity. They talk about equity this, equity that. Some people are actually ready for it. Some people are made for it. Some people are harmonious. But most people are not ready for equity. In equity, you really don't. Sometimes you might not get a second chance. Sometimes in equity, you might not really get juries to come look at the things. It might just be one judge dealing with the situation. Your whole life in just hands of one man or one woman. The option of asking for a jury trial is thrown out the window. Oftentimes in equity, if you don't come right, how they do it law, whereby they send you correspondence and they double speak. They speak in codes and things like that, whereby when you begin to read the order or correspondence or letter or whatever it is, or when they speak to you physically, at the beginning it sounds very discouraging and very negative, but somewhere in between the line, given that they're double speaking, they will give you the solution. Whether you pick it up, good. Whether you don't pick it up, oh well. That's how it is at law. But they will put it out there for you. Sometimes in equity, they're not going to do that. If you don't come right, they're going to tell you to fuck off. You ought to know better. Remember, equity done what ought to have been done. Meaning in the first place, you shouldn't have gone there, and somebody shot you. Okay, well, you shouldn't have gone there. Simple as that. It's kind of screwed up when you think about it, but you really have to come right. And you must understand how law works and the different types of law. Evidence law, contract law, all that stuff, trust, all that. You really have to know it. We're all learning, we're all growing. But don't be fanatical with it. Be honest with yourself. Be true to yourself as to what you're really ready for, what you're really about. Now, granted, in some circumstances, equity can be lenient. It can be very considerate. Equity can look deeper into things and not be arbitrary. But just keep in mind, the deeper things go, if you know you're not coming right, the worse is going to be for you. So you really, truly have to have clean hands and good faith. They kind of hint at it when it comes to law here and there. They kind of, it's like a wave of two different types of water slowly bouncing off of each other, or two different types of resonance kind of merging together. Every now and then, they kind of give you a feel of it. But do know that where equity is very lenient and is very considerate of things, if you were wrong and you are not coming right, you will suffer for it. A law might excuse that a little bit, and there's a lot of loopholes, that you can use to get out of certain things. Equity, which is an extension and a perfection of law, you're gonna get it. So thread slowly when you're talking about equity and dealing with equity. Learn the at-law stuff first. Equity is so raw to the point where things like constructive trust, which they do to most people when you go in these municipal courts and whatnot, where they just take your shit and just do what they want with it and create new things out of it. Believe it or not, constructive trust is under equity. They are actually using equity against people when they do constructive trust. Things like rescission of contract, modification of contract, that's equity. So long as you can show good faith, you're fine, you get away with it. So learn how at-law stuff works, and it would naturally blend and take you to where equity is. You will start to see it casually. And then you'll be able to invoke it appropriately when necessary. But don't run away from at-law stuff. Learn it. It will benefit. And only then will equity begin to reveal itself.